So next on the list is the 23rd President of the United States, Benjamin Harrison. We always try to look at five criteria, specifically growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and the most important criteria of all, do they leave the country better or worse? In terms of growth, I have a hard time right now with the Gilded Age president, and I think Harrison represents a turning point from where we've had a number of presidents up to this point that I would argue were trying to do the right thing in terms of reform. Um, Perhaps they were people who were trying to do things to make things better in terms of the spoils system, in terms of not getting entrenched in what was a very dirty general political environment with the party boss systems and corruption just being rampant, and that they themselves were in general trying to make efforts to reform that system. Harrison, I think, goes the other direction. I think Harrison was very much supporting political corruption in a number of ways. Not saying that he specifically himself was corrupt, but saying that some of his actions were clearly for political gain above any actual improvement of the country generally. The best example of this I can think of is there were more states created under Harrison than I think any other president. Under Harrison, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming all became states. That's, I guess, something you could argue in terms of growth. They met thresholds, but I think they had already met thresholds before. Perhaps they didn't. Argument, debate. All 12 of those then became GOP Senate seats. That was blatant and nakedly political in an attempt. And I think what I noticed about Harrison more than anyone I've seen since Van Buren, is just the brazen, open political acts that he committed throughout. And I mention that in terms of growth because I think this is a pivot point for America's conception of itself. Up to, I think you can break it down in kind of five. Well, we'll figure out how many it is when I count them off. The first five presidents or so, I would say, are the founding fathers. They're just trying to get the country to exist and to be considered a valid country, to not have what happened to Mexico happen to them, where basically they're a redheaded stepchild who is barely able to survive and is constantly harassed by European powers. We have the War of 1812, where we get to a point where we are now an established country who no longer has to worry about Europe coming in. We are going to stand on our own. And then the next set of presidents, I would say, is the Jacksonians up to the Civil War, where we're having a fight over what kind of country this is going to be, whether it's going to be a slave plantation, caste system kind of country, with manifest destiny on its mind of the expansion of westward expansion and taking control of the whole continent, perhaps. Or we're going to be what we eventually came. Well, maybe not became, you could argue that too. Or we're going to be a country that is more industrial, isn't worried about expansion. It's more about taking care of who we are in our time and kind of expanding industrially. Maybe that's overly flowery. But there was certainly a conflict that had to happen that resolved at the Civil War, and we were no longer a slave plantation country as an endorsement. Manifest destiny was still a debate going forward, but because of the Monroe Doctrine, it was still focused on North America primarily. There was some discussion of South America, more of a just leave this alone, Europe, don't come mess with this. This is our territory. And we definitely expanded into Mexico. But I think in terms of international overseas colonialism, that wasn't the direction we were going. You can argue Manifest Destiny is perhaps more cruel in some ways than colonialism because it required the genocide of the Native American people to just occupy and take the land. But I think colonialism is equally cruel in the terms of you're simply dehumanizing a group of people in a given area and saying you are subservient, you produce goods and services for the betterment of my country. Excuse me. And not for anything. Your country is now a servile state, a vassal of my country. And that's not something the United States up to this point had really engaged in. It was more territorial acquisition on borders to expand the territory itself of America, with the discussion of an expansion into Cuba, which I presume would have been an expansion into Cuba to remove the Cuban people and occupy the land. And in the intention of the South, we would keep the slaves, but that's secondary discussion. Harrison is the first small pivot that'll become a big pivot under McKinley toward actually engaging in colonialism and actually getting into the same type of mindset that the Europeans were, which is overseas expansion. And that included whether or not the United States was actively involved in the coup that took control of Hawaii, the tacit approval of it, and the planning to annex it. That falls on Harrison. How that fits for growth is difficult for me. One of the things that I've been doing this entire time is comparing it higher or lower than people before. I do think the country grew under Harrison in a lot of ways because of these ambitions. I think it also grew because of things like the Homestead Act, again, cruelly just basically having a race to get land. If you've seen the movie Far and Away, I think it's depicted in that movie where they have a line and everybody lines up and they race to get land. And it was a very weird way to do things, very competitive. The Gilded Age was a weird time. But I think it's one of those, I will say that you probably are going to give him some credit for growth, but at what cost is what I would ask. Speaking of cost, let's move on to finances. Finances are going to be horrible. First, even before we get into the Panic of 1893, he lost the midterms because of the $1 billion Congress. And basically the tariffs were very high, and then McKinley's act, who we'll talk about later as president, but when he's in this Congress, he passes these tariffs, which up to this point, most of the tariffs have been kind of reciprocal tariffs, where it was more, oh, you're going to tariff me, I'll tariff you back. There were some exceptions for protectionism, but it wasn't like an overwhelming protectionism, and most countries were using tariffs as their primary financing source. So even though tariffs are not great in terms of economic growth and prosperity, if everybody's making the same mistake, the effects of the mistake are more muted. This was different, and passing the McKinley tariffs really were fully protectionist tariffs and would lead in large part, there were other factors, but were a major cause of the Panic of 1893, which, as we discussed during Cleveland, is one of the biggest financial collapses in American history up to this point. And even now that we're in it, at this point in history, it's still one of the worst financial collapses. That falls on Harrison's lap. As I said, with Cleveland, you can make a strong argument that it wouldn't have lasted long had Cleveland done things differently, and that the extent and depth of the crisis does still fall on Cleveland in a lot of ways. But the creation of it falls on Harrison, and the wasteful and the wasteful spending of the $1 billion Congress is why he lost the midterm election. I mean, why the midterm elections were lost, and arguably why he lost the re-election to Cleveland, although there were other factors. So in terms of finances, very low marks, doing an awful job. In terms of international politics, I think it's a kind of a mixed bag. I've already made my complaint with regards to the drift toward imperialism, the Hawaii situation, but I do think he had a very effective Secretary of State in some ways by the name of Blaine, who was doing a lot of very effective negotiations to keep us out of things that could have escalated a lot more. There were some embargo situations. There were definitely some conflicts where other countries were definitely trying to pull us in, where we were able to navigate and avoid it. So I think in those terms, I will actually give him not necessarily positive marks in international politics. I would say of the 23 we have, he's middle of the road to slightly above middle of the road. War and security gets a little bit messy. Again, he did avoid the international stuff, but the national stuff less so. The Homestead Strike, which was basically the Pinkertons going to war with the iron workers in Pittsburgh. I've done a video on the history of unions that kind of goes over this, was on his watch. There was a lot of union infighting. The GOP was not interested or receptive to labor. One of the reasons he lost re-election was a third party emerged called the Populist Party that won states that probably would have traditionally gone to the GOP, and that was the difference. Cleveland did not get a majority in his re-election campaign. I think he only got 46% of the vote, but a third party took 5 states. Third party was never really a viable alternative that was going to be able to win the presidency, but it did operate in a spoiler capacity. I'm not saying that it would have shifted it one way or the other, but it's interesting that some of the states that were brought in to be Republican strongholds didn't actually go Republican because of the indifference to labor in part. There were other issues, but there was a real big discussion about the gold standard. I think there was a lot of inflationary problems, whether it should be gold standard, silver standard, or something in between. There's a lot of talk about that going around that probably also contributed to the financial collapse. I was reading into it, and I think it was something that at the time was much more fascinating to the people then. But looking back, I think it's pretty clear the tariffs were a bigger problem. But I think in terms of war and security, that's something that you have to. I don't think he was able to balance that well. I also Wounded Knee also falls on his watch. Him not either by intention or not intention. There's an argument made by I think it's Heather Richardson Cox that Harrison intentionally put people who are incompetent in positions of power so that they would have a pretext for the Homestead Act, have a pretext to go to war with the Sioux. I think it's the Sioux. Over Wounded Knee, and then use that pretext to seize the land, which he then gave to the settlers, which he then hoped would vote for him. In reading about Harrison, I would not put it past him. I don't know enough about the history to say that it was 100% that horribly cynical, but in everything else I'm reading with regards to Harrison, even if he personally wasn't that cynical, he certainly didn't seem to be invested that much in preventing anyone that cynical from being around him. On the flip side, you can make the argument that there needed to be reinvestment in the Navy and the Army, particularly in the Navy. I think we were down to 2 effective warships, and he did invest the money that would later continue to be invested in warships that gave the U.S. an actual effective military, an actual effective Navy. How that Navy was used later, I think, is not something you can blame Harrison for, although perhaps the discussion of the expansion being for purposes of trying to compete with the Europeans in imperialist goals and colonial goals, I think that's outside of the scope of what we're going to judge Harrison for. I'm going to say he probably ends up fairly neutral in terms of war and security. But in terms of better or worse, I would say you have to argue that he was worse based on everything I've said and a couple of other things. I don't want to attack Harrison with regards to civil rights as a specific, because I think if you look at him and compare him, particularly if you compare him to Cleveland, he really did make efforts to change some civil rights laws to get blacks more access to voting. He was completely unsuccessful, and the reasoning was almost certainly cynical because blacks were more likely to vote for the GOP than whites. There had been an attempt for some time I think it was called the Lily White movement, to convince some white Southerners to vote for the GOP that had been unsuccessful. And I think he was just trying to say, well, if we're going to win any Southern states at all, we're going to have to get get blacks greater access to voting. But he utterly failed at accomplishing that task. So I can't even give him credit because it was an utter failure. On the other hand, he also appointed the Supreme Court justice who wrote Plessy v. Ferguson. And that's going to be number 3 on our worst Supreme Court decisions of all time, or certainly in the running. We got Dred Scott so far in Cruikshanks, and I think Plessy is equally bad. The separate but equal standard really just crushing a lot of things. And again, Harrison didn't specifically do that, but he did pick the person who wrote it. The only things that I would say that kind of take him from being a complete awful presidency: 1, there were presidents who were worse, and 2, the Sherman antitrust laws were passed under his administration, but they weren't enforced. And so I'm not even giving him that much credit for that other than passing it. They really weren't enforced until Teddy Roosevelt comes into power, but they were passed. They are things that could, in theory, could have been used to temper some of the excesses of the Gilded Age. In reading all of this, I'm really reminded how bad the Gilded Age was, how consistently there were riots all the time. I knew about this from the labor video I did, which if you're watching this, you hopefully have watched the rest of my channel. The Breaking the President series is probably the least watched thing on my channel. It's something I'm doing as kind of aside for fun. But the video I did on labor breaks down the entire Gilded Age just had incredibly rich people who were creating these ridiculous monopolies and hiring private police forces to do horrible things to their workers. And that was going on under Cleveland and under Harrison. So during this entire time, and then under McKinley, that's really what was happening. And so both of them, I have a lot of negative views toward them, just acquiescing to so many horrible things being done on their watch while claiming everything is wonderful because some small numbers of people were becoming very rich thanks to industrialization and thanks to a lot of the processes then. So I'm looking at it that way, but I also then have to compare them to the other presidents. And so I'm looking at this. I would think Harrison and Cleveland are basically going to be in the same area, which is certainly below your John Adams, your Rutherford B. Hayes, your John Quincy Adams, who were, I think, presidents who didn't necessarily have great presidencies, but had good intentions and didn't have horrible presidencies. I think both Harrison and Cleveland had bad presidencies, and the country was worse for them being in office and in power. But I don't think it was worse to the point of like an Andrew Jackson or a Martin Van Buren. So the question is, do I put Harrison at 14 or 15? Cleveland being 15 if I put Harrison at 14. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put Harrison at 14 now. You might notice some changes in the sheet as I've been going through this. I have been not really adjusting scores that much, but one of the criteria that I'm working on is there are raw scores that I'm giving for each of the 5 criteria, but then there are also comparative scores. So as we're moving along, there are certain people who are moving up, not because their presidencies I'm viewing as better, but because they're still better relative to the other presidents that have come. So as you see the numbers adjust, that's probably the main reason why. As always, thanks for watching.